Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Mitten Kittens Book Club. I really hope you guys enjoyed episode 1. It was a really big test for me to figure out how I want to flow through these episodes and what I could do differently, and all of those really fun, challenging things that you always run into when you're starting something new. So, thank you guys for all the wonderful comments, and it just made me feel really good that other people appreciated what I had to say. So, now I'm just going to ruin it for you because this episode is really dark. I'm not going to lie. We are going to be doing a deep dive into Jennifer Hillier's Jar of Hearts. And let me tell you, this book is fascinating. It was written really well, almost too well, and it discusses a lot of way heavier topics than the last book. So, we're obviously not here for sunshine and rainbows. We're here to kind of dig our claws into the most intense and gruesome book you could ever read. And although this one, it's not in my top 3 so far of the books that I've read this year that absolutely terrify me, but the content in this book is pretty heavy. Jar of Hearts is not a book about a single crime. It has many different loopholes, you could say. It happens to be about violence, obviously, but what happens when people are silenced and they don't speak up, and when justice is served too late. It's going to be a little bit difficult for me because I don't know exactly what words would get flagged on YouTube. So if I say a random word, you just have to kind of use context clues to figure out what I'm actually saying because I don't want to have my video taken down. This story is about rape, murder, and the way trauma does not end when the perpetrator disappears. It tends to mutate, it travels, and it finds new bodies. And we'll get to that point towards the end of the book. Listener discretion is advised. In this episode, I will be talking about sexual assault, dismemberment, grooming, child murder, and manipulations. These are some very intense and heavy topics. So, of course, as I said in my other video or episode, I guess, if any of those trigger you, feel free to skip this episode or, check in for the next one. So, let's all take a breath, kind of ground ourselves, and let's talk about what Jar of Hearts is about. Because, like I said, it is extremely dark and disturbing, but overall, a fantastic book. So let's kind of get into who Jennifer Hillier is. She is a best-selling author known for her 7 psychological thrillers that she has published, which have been translated into at least 23 languages, which is so fascinating that you are so successful as an author that people all over the world want to read your books, even though, the main book wasn't written in their native language. So that is pretty intense and very fascinating. She is a type of author that thinks of the most absolute heinous crimes and even worse people, and she combines them all and writes about them. Her novels are mostly known for their intensity and plot twists, their explorations of human morality, and their depictions of complex internal conflicts fueled by violence and trauma. Jar of Hearts was published in 2018 and became her most recognized novel because it exposes something readers immediately, and I do mean immediately, recognize: the overall power a toxic relationship can have on a younger person and how far grooming and manipulation can push that person into doing pretty much anything their abuser may ask of them, whether it's something like they don't want to do or they wouldn't necessarily do on their own. It's all about the power play. Hillier understands trauma psychology, grooming, freeze responses, and coerced compliance, and how that can affect someone's psyche. But more importantly, she understands narrative blame, how stories are ultimately shaped to make outcomes feel reasonable, even when they are profoundly unjust. And this novel is not about redemption. It's about reckoning that comes far too late, and there's nothing anybody can do about it. Unless you have a time machine, of course, but it's a page turner and I couldn't put it down. I think I finished this book in maybe like 5 days. It was very intense. All right, so let's talk about the main characters in this book. First, we have Georgina Shaw, which she is referred to as Geo. And Geo is not a comfortable protagonist in this novel. And I think that's very intentional. This isn't a character you're meant to root for easily or forgive quickly. Hillier doesn't ask us to like Geo. She asks us to sit with her, and even though it is hard, we're just expected as readers to hear her story, and it just takes on a life of its own after that. When we meet Geo as a young teenager, she's already deep inside an abusive relationship with an older boyfriend. By the time things turned violent, she's already isolated from her friends, emotionally dependent, and afraid. What stood out to me is how thoroughly her ability to say no has been dismantled long before the crime even occurs. Fear becomes this rule book that she ultimately lives by. And I think that's why the book keeps circling back to the idea of responsibility under terror or duress. Geo really isn't free. She's trained to obey, conditioned to survive by compliance. And yet, she still plays a role in something unforgivable and absolutely unthinkable. The tension of her character lives right there between victimhood and accountability, and Hillier never lets us escape it. When Geo goes to prison, it doesn't feel like justice so much as a release for everyone else. Her sentence allows the world to move on, but when she's released, she definitely is not free. She becomes hypervigilant, emotionally guarded, and permanently marked by what she knows she did and didn't do. Geo survives her whole ordeal, but survival is the only victory she's really allowed in this novel, which is absolutely insane, which is another trope of, oh my gosh, should I feel bad for her or shouldn't I? Because there's a lot of things that do happen to this character. But at the same time, you think back, if you didn't do that first awful thing, none of these other things would happen to you. It's a really fun teeter-totter to think about, this idea of you shouldn't have done that, but hindsight is 2020. All right, so let's talk about the next character, Angela Wong. Angela Wong exists in the story mostly through absence, and that feels extremely deliberate. She's described as popular, well-liked. She has a wonderfully rich and stable family, someone with a future that felt almost guaranteed, and then it seems like almost in the blink of an eye that she's gone. What struck me is how little the narrative tries to soften Angela's death. She's portrayed as just a normal teenage girl who trusted the wrong people and paid for it with her life, unfortunately. The violence against her isn't sensationalized, but it is brutal and deeply personal. And once Geo is convicted, the system seems satisfied. The case is solved. Angela's name stops coming up. Her life becomes a closed chapter, not because justice was served, but because it became inconvenient to keep asking questions when we already knew who had done it. Angela's role in the book isn't about who she really was. It's about how easily someone can be lost when silence is easier than the truth. And also another twist, Angela and Geo were really good friends. They were both on the cheerleading team. And it's just unfathomable to think that you could do this to someone, not just another human in general, but literally your best friend. It's crazy. Next, we have the worst person in this entire book, Calvin James, also known as the Sweet Bay Strangler. Calvin James is terrifying, not because he looks like a monster, but because he doesn't. He's charming, confident, and easy to believe. He's the kind of man people trust by default, the kind no one thinks to question until the damage is already done. Calvin understands power without ever naming it. He learns early that fear does the heavy lifting for him, and that other people, especially women, will carry the consequences of his actions if he lets them. With Geo, he uses that power to shrink her world, tightening control until her choices exist only within the boundaries he sets himself. Crazy. Calvin doesn't see women as people. He sees them as things to own, beat, sexually assault, and dispose of when they stop serving him. Once he realizes he can get away with murder, that belief hardens into entitlement. His violence isn't chaotic or impulsive. It's intentional, calculated, and increasingly confident, which makes it all the more dangerous. He doesn't need a mask. He doesn't need theatrics. Calvin blends in, operates quietly, and disappears into normalcy. And that's why I think he's so dangerous. It's so wild. And he is just a vile man. It's heinous. And next we have the almost forever friend-zoned Kaiser Brody. Kaiser Brody occupies an uneasy middle ground in Jar of Hearts. He's both investigator and witness, someone responsible for uncovering the truth while being deeply entangled in it. Having grown up with Geo and Angela, the case is never just professional for him. It's personal in a way he can't escape. Kaiser survives by choosing order. He trusts structure, authority, and rules, even when those systems fail the people he cares most about. When Angela disappears, he accepts the version of events that allow his life to move forward. When Geo is convicted, he helps make that outcome possible, despite knowing the truth is incomplete. Years later, his guilt kind of starts to linger. He keeps watching Geo, still trying to understand her, still unable to let go. Kaiser isn't necessarily a villain, but he really isn't innocent either. He represents the cost of proximity and the damage that comes from telling only part of the truth. And echoing back to the forever friend-zoned, when they were all in high school, Kaiser had the biggest crush on Geo, and Geo never saw him in that light. She was like, "You're my best friend, you're fine." You know the story. The guy friend that's forever in the friend zone, which I thought was kind of funny and kind of relatable. It's almost like that situation you see in every sitcom nowadays, the forever friend, but then once they grow up, they become so handsome, successful, rich, you name it. And the last character that is pretty important in this book is Geo's father. Geo's father isn't portrayed as cruel or abusive, but he is profoundly passive. He never looks too closely at Calvin, and he never questions the story that casts his daughter as the primary wrongdoer. Accepting that version of events is easier. It allows him to keep moving forward without any disruption, without guilt, and without having to confront uncomfortable truths. Hillier uses him to show that harm doesn't always come from direct action. Sometimes it's built through avoidance, through silence, emotional distance, and the quiet decision not to ask harder questions. When people say they didn't know, this is often what they mean. They chose not to know. His constant absence reinforces that choice. As a doctor, he's always working, always busy, always justified in being elsewhere, like at the hospital. That busyness becomes both a shield and an excuse, offering him a way to remain detached while convincing himself that his ignorance was technically unavoidable. But I do also agree that I think it is a choice. All right, kittens, let's dig in to what this book is about. At its core, Jar of Hearts is about a single violent act and the chain reaction it sets off. Kind of like when you toss a pebble into the water and the rings grow bigger and bigger and bigger and just like expand to like almost infinity. That's kind of how this whole book plays out. The story begins when the remains of Angela Wong, a 16-year-old girl who vanished years earlier, are finally discovered. For more than a decade, her disappearance sat unresolved. A quiet absence everyone learned to live around, unfortunately. When her body is found, it feels like justice is finally waking up. But what's uncovered is far worse than a cold case finally closing. I can't imagine the grief, anger, and sadness her family and friends had to endure, not knowing what happened, where she ended up, constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop, but it never does. It's just a feeling I really don't want to understand. Angela wasn't killed by a stranger. She was murdered by someone she trusted, Geo's older boyfriend, Calvin James, after she threatened to expose him for raping her. What makes her death so disturbing isn't just that she was killed, but how. It wasn't quick. It wasn't distant. It was very, very intimate and violent and absolutely meant to silence her permanently. And afterward, her body was dismembered and buried, as if erasing her piece by piece could erase the truth along with her. And Angela wasn't alone. Her best friend, Geo, was there, not as the person who committed the murder, but as someone so deeply groomed, manipulated, and psychologically trapped that she had helped clean up what happened and stayed silent for years. And I mean years. And the book never lets us forget that Angela's death wasn't just an act of violence, it was an act of betrayal. That silence becomes the hinge point of this entire novel. And I want to clarify, Calvin wasn't just a year older than 16-year-old Geo. Not even 2 years older. He was 21 years old. absolutely disgusting and vile. But Geo fell for him very quickly and became consumed in this toxic, grooming, and abusive relationship. And even worse, we find out that Geo was responsible for Angela being dismembered. The ground was too rocky and hard to dig a deep enough hole to hide Angela. So Geo had instructed Calvin to go grab a saw from her father's shed because they decided to take her body behind Geo's house because there's some woods. And what better place to discard a body than the middle of the woods? This part was just so scarring. And what kind of makes it interesting is Calvin at this time was too squeamish to cut Angela up. He ended up vomiting all over himself. So Geo did. She hacked up her friend. Oh, it was so vile. I can't grasp the mental state someone like that would be in to not only cover up a murder, but to also dismember and bury your best friend. Absolutely psychotic. And what's even worse is Calvin doesn't stop after murdering Angela. He learns from that first murder not just how to kill, but how to avoid consequences. Geo ultimately absorbs the blame. The case is buried, and Calvin walks away free, carrying the confidence that comes from getting away with something absolutely unspeakable. Over time, he ends up killing again and again and again, always targeting women who are vulnerable, always operating in the spaces where people are easy to be overlooked. Women no one would really miss. Which sounds like a classic line Olivia Benson from Law & Order SVU would say. Just saying. Years later, when the truth finally surfaces, Calvin is arrested and Geo goes to prison for her role in concealing the crime. On paper, it looks like accountability, but the damage has already spread too far because the violence doesn't end there. As the story moves forward, the book reveals its most devastating turn. The violence didn't end with Calvin's arrest. It didn't end with Geo's sentence. The harm carried forward into the next generation. New bodies began appearing, women and children, and each crime scene carries a message. See me. The murders that follow aren't really random. Women and their children that they gave up for adoption began turning up dead. The children's chests are marked with the words, "See me," in red lipstick. And slowly, the truth emerges. The killer is Calvin and Geo's son, a child shaped by abandonment, abuse, neglect, secrecy, and inherited trauma. A life formed in the aftermath of a crime no one fully reckoned with when it truly mattered. Now, a little backstory on how truly messed up this was. The last time Geo ever saw Calvin after Angela's murder was when he had snuck into her bedroom window, informed her he was going to disappear. And like the narcissistic cat poop of a person he is, he violently grapes her, taking her innocence and further traumatizing her. It was very hard to get through this chapter for myself because it was very detailed. A couple weeks later, Geo finds out that she's pregnant and decides to give the child up for adoption. She chooses a wonderful married couple that seems like they were so in love at the time and successful. But as fate would have it, the father had cheated on the wife, leaving her for his mistress and leaving her with young Dominic to raise all alone. She becomes an alcoholic and ends up dying in a DUI car crash, leaving poor Dominic to fend for himself. The father didn't want him at all. He was very happy with his new life. So he went into the foster care system, where we know sexual assault and overall abuse is rampant, contributing to Dominic's overall mental state and traumatizing him even more. It's the perfect instruction guide on how to build a serial killer with no empathy, filled with anger and no love for anyone. In the end, Geo ends up killing both Calvin and Dominic in the most disturbing way. And not only that, it was done in like 3 pages of the book, the most climactic event, and was rushed, and then just bam, it was over. At least that's how I felt when I read it. It just felt like, oh my gosh, this is gonna happen, and it's over. And then it starts to settle into the ending pages, which is kind of wild for me. You just kind of wanted more, but I thought that part was still written really well, even though for me it went by a little too quick. Overall, Jar of Hearts isn't asking who committed these crimes. It's asking who created the conditions for them. It's a story about grooming, silence, and the catastrophic cost of delayed justice. About how one act of violence left unexamined doesn't disappear. It multiplies. Oh boy, was that just the most heart-wrenching, skin-crawling story that you have ever heard. I thought it was so fantastic. Of course, I didn't touch upon every single event that happened in the book. You'll have to read it for yourself, which I don't know how you can imagine even more happens, but trust me, it's a really good read, especially if you're into that creep factor. But it's just a roller coaster of emotions of what's going to happen next and who's doing what. Was that character good? Was that character bad? I didn't see this coming. It was absolutely insane. All right, my little murder mittens, let's get into what this book kind of meant to me in more of a literary analysis type of vibe. So one of the things I really enjoyed about this book was when that was Gamora jumping on my computer. Okay, great. One of the things I found most interesting about this book was the whole section about Geo's time in prison and how it altered her character and how it altered her character when she was released. Geo's prison sentence isn't written as a redemption arc at all. It isn't healing or transformative, like at all. And honestly, like I mentioned before, worse things happen to Geo in prison, but you'll have to read the book to find that out if you really want to know. It's disturbing. What it is instead, though, is slow, grinding, and deeply isolating for Geo while she is on the inside. When she gets out, she really isn't reformed in a way. She's more like altered. Prison teaches her how to survive inside a system that rewards silence, submission, and staying in the shadows. To protect herself, she's forced to align with a powerful drug dealer on the inside, and she uses that connection as a shield against the physical and sexual violence she faces from other inmates. Survival isn't about justice or morality behind prison walls. It's more about who you know, what leverage you have, and how well you can make yourself untouchable. Geo adapts. She learns. She does what she has to do. But that adaptation comes at a cost. Even after her sentence ends, even after she walks free, the damage remains. Prison doesn't rehabilitate her, it hardens her. It teaches her to trust no one, to operate quietly, and to expect violence as a constant threat. She leaves with scars that don't fade once the bars are gone. She survives in the end, obviously, but survival is not the same thing as healing. And I thought her time in prison was just so crazy and entertaining to see the operations behind the scenes, what the inmates do to each other, how they can build these little, I don't know, their own little power forces. Like who's the top dog, who's the middle dog, and who is just like defenseless. It was very, very entertaining and also very, very disturbing, but it was a great chapter to read. One of the things Jar of Hearts kept pulling me back to was how clearly it highlights generational and psychological trauma and how easily that trauma can become a breeding ground for violence. The book explores the idea that, extreme violence doesn't appear out of nowhere. It's shaped, reinforced, and can often be inherited. That a psychopath can be born, raised, or molded throughout years of neglect, abuse, and emotional deprivation until empathy never fully develops and human life becomes something disposable. These characters weren't given a real chance at anything resembling a normal life. They were failed early, repeatedly, and catastrophically, to say the least. And by the time anyone might have intervened, it was already too late. That's especially true for Dominic. This is where the theme of generational trauma truly takes hold. The violence in this book doesn't end with Angela. It doesn't stop with Geo's imprisonment. It continues forward. It bleeds into the next generation. When we learn that Geo's son, Dominic, becomes a serial murderer of women and children, it doesn't feel like a shocking twist. It feels like a grim inevitability, a continuation, history echoing through the next generation. The book makes the inheritance of harm and its resulting lack of empathy impossible to ignore. Dominic doesn't just resemble Calvin biologically, he mirrors him psychologically, which is crazy. The entitlement, the need for control, the obsession with being seen. When the words "see me" appear at crime scenes, they don't really feel all that random. They read like a demand for recognition from a mother, from a system, from a world that failed him long before he ever had a chance. Even structurally, the novel reflects this idea of generational trauma. Information is withheld, timelines are fractured, keeping readers disoriented and uncomfortable. Revelations arrive late, just like justice does. There's no moment where everything balances out. No clean moral victory. No clear answer about how any of this could have been prevented. And I think that's the point. Jar of Hearts argues that when trauma is buried instead of confronted, it doesn't disappear. It mutates. It creates new victims, like Dominic, and ensures that those who survive abuse and neglect carry that weight for the rest of their lives, desperately trying to right what was done to them, sometimes in horrifying and sadistic ways. Absolutely crazy. And like I have been wondering this whole time reading this book, what does the title mean? At least to me, this is how I took it. Because Jar of Hearts, the title, sounds almost harmless if you don't know what's inside. In the book, the title comes from something deceptively small, a mason jar filled with cinnamon heart candies that Calvin had given to Geo. On the surface, it's supposed to be sweet, an apology, a peace offering. But here, the timing matters. He gives it to her after the first time he hits her. And once you know that, the gesture stops being cute and starts to become deceptive and almost like a wolf in sheep's clothing type of thing. And the hearts aren't even for Geo. They're Calvin's favorite candy, not Geo's, which kind of tells you everything you need to know about how he understands love. Even when he's sorry, the moment still centers him. The jar isn't about comfort. It's about control dressed up as affection. Calvin genuinely believes this is love. That's what makes it unsettling. His version of love is possessive, conditional, and violent, but he never sees it that way, obviously. So the jar becomes a stand-in for his entire relationship with Geo. Bright on the outside, full of sweetness and promises, but deeply rotten at its core. Geo accepts the jar because she thinks it's pretty. And that little detail hurts. It shows how young she is, how naive, and how unprepared she is to recognize danger when it's wrapped in something that looks so romantic. To her, the jar feels like reassurance. To us, it's a warning sign screaming in neon red lights. And that's where the title really opens up. That jar isn't just holding candy. It's holding everything no one wants to talk about. Fear, guilt, rage, and trauma that never gets processed. It's harm sealed up and labeled as love. And the problem with sealing things away like that is they don't really disappear. They sit, they fester, and they get heavier and heavier. And eventually, the jar breaks. And when it does, everything that was contained inside comes spilling out into new lives, new victims, and new violence. This book isn't about love at all. It's about what happens when we mistake possession for devotion and call it something beautiful instead of what it really is. At least that's how I took it. And also, like a lot of other people, probably made the connection to the song Jar of Hearts, which the book actually does mention, which was very, very funny because when I saw the title of this book for the first time, that was what I thought of, and that is my cat's automatic feeder. Sorry. But Hillier introduces the title saying that, yes, it is kind of a representation of the song in story form, in a sense, because the song is about, an abusive, toxic relationship. And that's exactly what this book is all about. An abusive, toxic relationship that is just so damning and so evil and ugly. And even though, like the song, it sounds so beautiful and it looks so perfect, but really, on the inside, it's rotten and absolutely disgusting on the inside. So I thought that was interesting, but that was my first thought before I actually read the whole book and had a chance to think about it was, wow, was this named after the song? So I thought that was really interesting that Hillier did actually mention that in the book. So, kittens, here is what I have for you to sit with. My fun little questions. Was Geo's sentence justice, or was it convenient? Do you believe she paid for her crimes? And that is such a loaded question, but from my point of view, I think that it really wasn't justice, only because Angela's no longer here. Angela's gone. She never made it past 16. She will never grow up. She will never get married. She will never have kids. She will never have a life, a career, do something with her life. She didn't have the chance because Calvin and Geo killed her. Well, Calvin killed her, but Geo helped cover it up. So in that essence, to me, I don't think so, because that person, Angela, is no longer here. But yet Geo, even though her prison sentence and what happened to her in prison was completely awful and also disturbing, she still got to be released young enough to where she could start over, to fall in love, to get in a relationship, to have a child, to move on with her life, even though her life is going to continue to be altered. She has the chance to have one, whereas Angela really doesn't, because she's gone. So I don't really think so. I think she should have been in there longer, but of course, due to her agreeing with, like, you know, a plea deal to turn on Calvin and all of the technicalities of law and order, let's say, obviously she paid for what she had done. But I mean, to me, I don't think so. And of course, I can't forget the old nature versus nurture concept. This really fun question that starts a lot of arguments. Do you think serial killers are born, raised, or both? This question is definitely never a clean debate, because the way I see it, it's almost always both. Some people may be born with traits that make empathy harder or aggression easier, but those traits don't exist in isolation. Environment decides whether they're challenged or reinforced. Trauma doesn't create violence out of nowhere, out of thin air. But when pain goes unaddressed, it doesn't disappear either. It festers and it mutates. And understanding how someone became who they are isn't the same as excusing what they do. But it does force us to ask harder questions about neglect, silence, and systematic failure. Because people don't just inherit DNA, they inherit unresolved damage. And when that damage is ignored for long enough, it tends to show up louder in the next generation, kind of in the form of generational trauma per se. So I do think it's both in a way. If you have the DNA inside you and you're also put in a crappy situation like Dominic was, where he was abused, where he was neglected, where he felt unloved, not seen by anybody, that DNA inside him that he inherited from Calvin was basically lit on fire, and it was go time. Does not excuse what he did, what he turned into, but it sparked that fire to take his whole personality and psychology and bring it to the next level and bring it to the surface. So I think it definitely is a both scenario, at least for me. But I would love to know what other people think, because this is something that so many people love to debate on, and I love to know what other people think as well. Alrighty, before we move on and go watch a bunch of really fun cat videos on TikTok, I want to ground this story in some real world context in my Claw and Order section, because the abusive dynamics in Jar of Hearts aren't rare or exaggerated. Unfortunately, they're very, very painfully common. According to the CDC, more than 1 in 3 women in the United States and about 1 in 4 men will experience physical violence, sexual violence, or stalking by an intimate partner at some point in their lifetime. While we narrow that down to severe physical violence, things like choking, beating, or the use of a weapon, that's about 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men. And abuse isn't always physical. Nearly half of all adults report experiencing psychological aggression from a partner. Things like controlling behavior, threats, humiliation, or isolation. That kind of abuse doesn't leave bruises, but it can be just as damaging. And in many cases, it's what traps people in dangerous relationships long before the violence may escalate. Each year in the US, an estimated 10 million people experience some form of intimate partner violence. And experts are very clear about this. These numbers are likely underreported. Fear, shame, financial dependence, and emotional manipulation keep many victims silent, sometimes for years. So when we talk about Geo's silence or the way Calvin was able to continue harming people, it's important to remember that this isn't just a plot device. It reflects real patterns. Abuse thrives in secrecy. Violence escalates when control is threatened. And silence, whether it's forced, manipulated, or chosen out of fear, can have devastating consequences. And that's what makes stories like this unsettling, not because they're unbelievable, but because they're so familiar. If you or someone you know is experiencing abuse or feels unsafe in a relationship, please know there are people who can help. You can call or text the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-SAFE. That's 1-800-799-7233. Or visit thehotline.org for confidential support and resources. For younger listeners, visit loveisrespect.org. They offer similar support with a text line option. Text "love is" to 22522. And remember, you are not alone, and you don't have to navigate this without help. So we've come to the end of this episode, and I want to thank everyone for sticking through this one, because this one was really aggressive and really dark and hard to get through, especially for me, because I didn't like writing my notes with these very descriptive words, because they are not fun to write. But I really enjoyed this book, and I highly recommend it to anybody that, like I said before, really wants that creep factor and wants to be put on a tilt-a-whirl version of what's going on, who's doing what, and all of these unexpected turns, twists and turns that, I mean, I never saw it coming, but maybe other people did. But I thought it was a fascinating book. And to conclude, Jar of Hearts is not a story about closure at all. You're kind of left with a, what? At least I am. But it's more of a story about containment failing. So hold your jars carefully, kittens, because what we refuse to look at doesn't disappear. It lurks in the dark and waits. And eventually, it demands to be seen, because nothing stays buried forever. See you next time.